Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for CRA Mondays. Today is June 9th, 2025, and I'm very excited to have Arnaud come and talk to us about salsa, because salsa is a really interesting tool, framework, set of specs. Arnaud will tell us all about this in a few minutes and make me look. Anyway, but I'm really interested about it because it feels like a really important part of securing the supply chain, and it's a piece of technology that has started off, at least in some circles, was not like the best reputation possible. And I think a lot of that is based on misunderstandings of where the spec is at and what it's trying to do and what's actually in it. And I feel like it was very useful to learn more about it and also get a number of misconceptions about it cleared. And so I'm super happy to welcome Arnaud today to talk to us about it. Arnaud, if you want to maybe introduce yourself and then just
Sure.
get us started. And then we have ample time, hopefully, for questions and discussions at the end of the call. So over to you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you for being here. I'm happy to participate and try to shed some light on this. Um, I mean, just as a very short intro, I'm an old open technology specialist. I've been working in open source and open standards for a very long time. I did my first open source contribution in 1990, and I met Toby years ago in W3C, and I've been working with the Linux Foundation open source for several years. In OpenSSF, I've been participating for like 3.5 years or so. And so I'm actually a member of the technical advisory committee of OpenSSF. And I have actually been a maintainer of the SLSA specification. Um, as a full disclosure, I'm actually not a security specialist. As I said before, my specialty is really in standards and open source in general. And so over the years, I worked on many different technologies. And as of late, I've been working in OpenSSF. And when I came to OpenSSF, I thought, I looked around all the different things they were working on. My goal was simply to try to help. And I thought salsa was interesting, and it looked like a spec, but it wasn't quite like a spec initially. And I thought, oh, this is a good fit for me because there was a group there of people who were clearly much more savvy when it comes to security than I am, but didn't have much background at all in specification development. And so I thought, well, there's a pretty good match. I can bring something they don't have. So with that being said, don't be surprised if you can probably easily corner me on technical issues, but I think I can, I've been participating in this project for several years, and I think I can give you at least a good understanding of what salsa is about. So without further ado, let's get going. So just before we get into salsa, I wanted to say a few words about OpenSSF, just to you understand what it is. It's yet another Linux Foundation kind of organization. It came from the realization when the whole, landscape of cybersecurity exploded into our face, so to speak, right? We saw a huge increase in attacks. The industry said, okay, what are we going to do about it? And of course, there are plenty of efforts all over the place. This is not to ignore all the other good stuff that's going on. But in particular, the Linux Foundation said, let's get going with an organization that focused on this. And initially, it started in 2020. You may remember these were the COVID days, and the companies were not too sure what the economic impact was going to be to their bottom line. So they were not too eager to put a lot of money into anything new. And so we started with an organization that was very like organic, but with very little support. And so it's only at the end of the COVID era where people said, okay, the sky didn't fall on our face. We can reboot instead essentially the organization with the real funding and a proper structure. That's when I started getting involved. I won't bore you with all the detail. This is just an overview of the structure. What's interesting is So we have, the governing board, technical advisory council, and then underneath this, we have essentially two big types of groups. We have working groups that work on many different aspects. And then we have projects which we distinguish by the fact that they are focusing on code development. And this is not the full picture because we have many other projects than the two that we're showing there, because working groups have projects themselves, right? And so this gives you a more complete picture. I'm not going to go through all of this. Obviously, that would take a long time, and that's not really the topic here. It's just to give you an idea of the breadth of all the different activities that we have in OpenSF. It's pretty, significant, and we have more projects coming in all the time. This is another view of all these different projects based on a view which may look familiar to you, and I will get into again in this presentation because it's actually based on a view that was promoted by SLSA initially, that basically, represent the CI/CD typical pipeline, and we're trying to map all the different activities of OpenSF onto this pipeline and try to see where their gaps are and maybe where we want to develop more in terms of OpenSSF in general. So some examples of the things that the OpenSF does. There's a lot of work that has been done, especially at the beginning, but it continues into trying to develop material guidelines, courseware, so that the realization being, well, we at least need to make sure that people are well educated, they have access to everything. So for instance, the course is completely free. And so there is no excuse, for a developer today not to have at least a minimum understanding of what the problem is and what they need to take into account when they are starting developing source code. And then we have a bunch of technologies that are more aiming at basically assessing the security level of a project. And so we have things like Scorecard that runs a bunch of tests against a repository. What's interesting is not so much about the code. It doesn't look for vulnerabilities and that kind of stuff. It really looks at the how the project behaves. So it will look, for instance, at activities in terms of like, do you have a whole bunch of pull requests being ignored, or is the project active and alive, reacting to pull requests and so on. And so it tries to see, like, do you have a security MD5? All the signs that may actually show that this is a project that you can trust as is trying to at least do a good job at, improving the security posture. All of this to help, people who work in the project to do better, but also to help the consumer of those projects. When you want to add a dependency to your code, maybe you should check the scorecard associated to that project. And so we have a whole bunch of things also in that list. We also have tools. Sigstore is now fairly well known. It tackles this long issue of signing artifacts with the problem that, well, nobody checks the signature. Developers are very bad at maintaining their keys and so on. So it tries to make this whole process of signing artifacts and verifying them much easier. And so we have a bunch of other activities. I just want to move on to really get into the crux of what this presentation is about. So SLSA, as I said, so SLSA is actually, it's been around for a while. And as I said, when I joined, they had actually just started working on SLSA within OpenSSF. And it's often misunderstood. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to explain what this really is about, because it is indeed not so easy to define. It's not a tool in the sense that there's no code, right? So that's why it's more like a specification. It's a framework. It started with a checklist that was more inspirational in nature than anything else. And I'll explain, part of my contribution was to actually turn to in something that's much more rigid and looks more like a standard specification, no pun intended, where you actually have, a more strict language being used, defining requirements and who the requirements apply to, which is also wasn't so clear initially. And so what this is about trying to provide both, producers of artifacts, source, but the producers of build environment platforms, as well as the consumer, all of these people to try to do better and increase the security posture of the overall supply chain. So how do we do this? We do this with a whole bunch of different checks that I will get into. The main outcome of SLSA, practically speaking, is to collect a bunch of information related to how an artifact, where it comes from, and how it was produced. So in many ways, it feels like an SBOM. I assume you all have heard of SBOM, software bill of material. The difference is that SBOMs, at least in the initially, right, they were mostly focusing on tell you, okay, what are the pieces that are in that software? And there are many requirements now that governments say, I'm not going to buy your product unless you tell me what it is. And the analogy that everybody uses is like the list of ingredients on a food product, right? So SLSA, is kind of a way to think of it based on that analogy is to think that, well, SLSA is more about how the ingredients were used and what is the recipe that was actually used with all these ingredients to produce that product. So SLSA, especially in the first version that we produced, was mostly focusing on the build part of the whole chain. And there is a bit of overlap because SBOM started from this is what's in the product rather than how the product was built. And they are evolving towards saying, oh, but we also want to provide information about how it's built. And SLSA did kind of the other way around. I'm happy to say that we are trying to talk to one another, those two communities, and there are efforts underway to try to make sure that we don't just duplicate everything. There is a risk that there is some overlap and duplication, but that's basically how those two things can be compared and differentiated based on one another. So I touched a little bit on this part in my previous slide, talking about who is it for, right? So it's for people who are producing artifacts, consuming them, or providing infrastructure, such as the build platform that you're going to use. So for the producers, it's to basically have protection against tampering and insider threats. So how do you make the build more resistant to attacks? For consumer, it's a way to be able to verify that what they are going to consume is indeed secure, they can trust it. And then for the infrastructure providers, so these are the people who actually, like IBM and others, who are providing build platforms, right? It's like, well, how do we make sure that those platforms provide the security, characteristic that our customers are going to want? So you can recognize here this the supply chain. It looks very similar to the one I showed earlier with the OpenSF different groups and activities because it's the original of that diagram. It's actually the newer version of this, but it tries to capture the essential of the software supply chain. So of course, we have the part that consists, that's about the source. So you have the people who actually produce the source and going to distribute it. Then it goes through a build process. Then it generates some artifacts from the build that gets distributed and eventually consumed. And of course, there is a cycle into this because the source might call on to, importing other artifacts. They may be using tools that come from other producers, obviously. And so there's a set cycle there with dependencies. And all of those letters identify points of vector attacks, essentially, in the software supply chain. So to be clear, SLSA is not pretending to address all of those. We just started to tackle some of them. We may never get to tackle some of them. And part of them is also, there are many different players, obviously, involved in this schema. And we don't necessarily, want to tell everybody how they should behave, but we are going to try to address the most important ones that we feel like we can make a difference on. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So in short, at a high level, you can consider that SLSA provides a few things. First, it gives us a common vocabulary. This is important because when you talk about this kind of issues, you realize quickly that people talk about many different things. And it was one of the problems we had with the very first version of SLSA, which actually came to OpenSSF. There were some terms that, as I will say, this was actually initially created by Google, and they had their own internal language and way to talk about things that seemed obvious to them. And when they came, which is typical, Toby knows this space well, you come to a standards body with your own spec, and then you're surprised, but people have a completely different reading of your words and what you think it means. And so that generates a lot of discussion. So one of the things that SLSA does is provide a clear vocabulary to talk about those kind of problems. And then it's basically a way to secure your supply chain and evaluate whether you can actually trust the artifacts that come from it that you're going to consume. It's in the form of a checklist. We have kept that very characteristic. That was from the beginning, and I'll get into what those look like. And so I think this last bullet is actually relevant to you guys because from my understanding is this is the kind of stuff you're trying to do is, okay, there's more and more regulations coming up about how you produce software, what you need to do to ensure that, customers and users in general are not being put at risk. And so SLSA is one of the tools that can be used to try to, assess how well you're doing. So it's also important to know the limit of SLSA and to, differentiate it from other things. So the first thing is it's not a security scanner. It may seem obvious, but, a lot of people don't really understand. They think you talk security, they think vulnerability scanning. That seems to be a reflex. And so, I just want to make clear that this is not what this kind of stuff is. And so as a consequence, it also has limitations. There are plenty of things that it cannot do anything about, right? So especially insider threats. We have seen many cases already that has happened. And there are things like typo squatting, which basically, developer error. They type the wrong name. Well, we're not going to be able to do anything about this. There may be tools that may be smart enough to say, are you sure this is the module you mean to import? And so on. But we are not tackling this. And so there are things like, if there is code that is insecure, we're not going to do anything about that either. But on the other end, so what it does is that especially, we're going to try to, like I said, accumulate information about how artifacts are generated so that we can communicate this with the artifact and people can make verification, ensure that, whatever their security level or comfort is, what their requirements is, they can actually make the assessment in a very, systematic way to decide whether this is a good thing for them to use or not. And on an ongoing basis, obviously, because this is not the kind of stuff you can do one-off. So just a quick story, as I mentioned earlier, this was actually started by Google. They did this for their own purpose internally initially. And that's why the document initially was very much written. It was more inspirational than anything else. So it said, oh, this is the kind of stuff you should do to try to improve the security posture. And they were trying to disseminate this throughout the Google organization themselves. And then when OpenSSF started, they thought, oh, maybe we could externalize this. It could be useful to others. So they brought it to OpenSSF in 2021. And there was this first version that was published in 2021, version 01. I mean, and as I said, this is when it generated a whole sorts of questions. And so it already had this notion of like, different levels. There was level 1 to 4, and with a progression, more and more stringent requirement. But they were a mixed bag of all sorts of different considerations that just thought that, these were good measures to take in general. When we started talking about those things inside OpenSSF with people from different organizations, quickly there was a lot of realization, okay, we had a repo, obviously, and we started opening issues, and the number of issues literally exploded. And we said, oh my God, what are we going to do? We'll never get done. So we actually ended up reducing the scope drastically, and we eventually managed to publish version 1.0 in April 2023. We had it was tough work. I mean, there was a lot of goodwill. There was a lot of work to do. It took us quite a while, but we did it. And then after that, there was a bit of a lump. People seemed to be focusing on other things. And then it took us a while to get restarted again. And so that's why it took us a long time to get to 1.1. And we have been working on a whole bunch of different things that we'll talk about. But the 1.1, don't expect there isn't that much of a difference with the 1.0. I can tell you quickly. So the 1.0, as I said earlier, is much more stricter in its definition than the previous version. It also is a reduced scope. So in particular, in SLSA 1.0, we are focusing solely on the build part, and we actually gave up on level 4. So level 4 actually touch, I can tell you, on reproducible build. And this term alone is controversial because people have all sorts of different expectations as to what it meant. So we said, okay, let's not do this one, we'll do it later. So in a sense, what you have to remember is, so the spec is stricter in its language, in its form. It introduces, in addition to levels, different tracks, because we said, well, we can't do everything. So let's separate the different topics. So we are going to have a build track. We expect it to have a source track, and then dependencies, and maybe others. And we'll see now that we have more. And so we gave up on level 4 for the build track, leaving it this notion of reproducible build to later. I'll leave it at this just for the sake of. Well, I need to point out the end. The last piece is actually key, and I'll get back to it. But it's so at the end of the day, what is generating is a document in the form of an attestation, which we call provenance. That actually is the result of the generating of the artifact through the build process. This is where you actually accumulate all the information about what went into the build process that people are going to be able to verify. And because verification is not always possible or desirable by everybody, we have this notion of verification summary attestation, which allows to have delegation of the actual verification process of all the gory details and focus more on giving people the overall outcome. So 1.1, as I said, is a fairly minor update, which we did earlier. Essentially, we're trying to work on the next version with source tracks and so on. And it was taking longer than we wanted. So we said, okay, let's release all the clarification, all the minor stuff already out. So we produced 1.1 earlier this year. So let's get into a little bit what's in those tracks. So the build track introduced those 3 levels that I talked about. Essentially, the first one is very low level. It's pretty easy to, most people get there. Just basic normal engineering would get you there. But it has this notion that you're producing a provenance that will, as I said, along with the artifact, you have this information that tells you how the artifact was produced. In level 2, you actually have to sign this, and it has to be generated by a hosted build platform. The idea of being that, well, if the developer builds the artifact on his own computer, who knows what's going on there, right? So if already it's hosted, like imagine you're using a GitHub action, well, already it's no longer in the control of a developer. They can't tamper so easily with the build process, right? And then level 3, you're hardening the build platform further to ensure that, they cannot, no other, oops, sorry, with there. And so this is another view of this. So it touches on the two different dimensions, the two different audience that we have in this case. So we have the producer, that's the actual, the producer of the artifact. So their requirement is pretty simple. They have to choose which build platform they are going to use. They take responsibility in doing this. It's important, right? It seems maybe silly, but it's an important aspect. They have to also follow a consistent build. So this is like reproducibility of the build process, right? You have to have automation involved and so on. And they are responsible for distributing the provenance along with their artifacts. On the build platform, producers, and they have to generate the provenance, and there are different levels. First, they need to make sure it exists. Then they need to make sure it's authentic, so they sign it, and then they need to make sure that the signature is not forgeable. So think of like, adding requirements as to, like secrets, where is your private key stored, who has access to it. That's the difference between, authentic and forgeable. You make it more difficult. First one is it has to be signed, and then you have to make sure this is the right party who signed it. And then on the isolation, as I said, we have hosted, and then isolated means that you cannot have multiple builds happening in the same environment. You want all the different builds to be separated from one another, so there is no risk of contamination from one build to another. I touched briefly on this earlier. I'm not going to get too much into the detail, but essentially, for the sake of time, this is really the main output that we expect in the SLSA in the build track, and we have a similar concept for other tracks that we are now working on. But so it's this notion of attestation that are bound to the artifact that are being produced, that are more than just, in traditional, those of us who've been doing software releases for a long time, signing at the time we would sign your tar file with the public key, and you publish this, and people can verify it has not been modified. So this along these lines, but now you have this attestation that can contain a lot more information about where the build was made, with what software, and all the different tools that were used, different parameters that were introduced in the build, and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, the VSA is also an important part, because it's not always practical to expect every party to go through it can be quite, onerous to verify the attestations. And you may not even have all the means to do it. So you might be happy as a consumer to just delegate that responsibility to a third party who is going to take the burden of verifying and then certifying that, yes, I have verified this artifact, the build is, correct, and you can trust it. And then, it's always like this when it comes to security, right? You trust something at some point. You have to say, okay, this is where I draw the line. And so this is a way to do it where you actually delegate that verification. I'm not going to get too much into the details. Some of you may be familiar with this notion. So in the case of SLSA, we chose to base it on in toto attestations. It's a pretty standard framework that, where basically you have an artifact, you can look up the provenance, and there may be different attestations attached to this. Each attestation basically has an envelope. There are different formats that can be used, but they all kind of have the same structure, where it contains a body or message that is signed. And then in that message, once you have verified that the signature is correct, it has not been tampered with, you can look into it, and this is where the interto part comes into play, where you can have there's a bunch of different subjects, and SLSA has added a few of them. And then with predicates, the predicates and the subject applies to the artifact. Otherwise, you have a problem, obviously. And so, and it's recursive. The predicate itself can point to other things. So it's very important. And, this is the verification is still very important, right? And, I have this analogy I often repeat is that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't do us any good if all the people who produce stuff do everything they can to secure all their stuff and provide consumer with, the way to verify that what they are actually using is indeed what was produced, has not been tampered with in any way. If people don't check that, and the analogy to me is, we are mandating car producers to have seat belts in their cars. But if people don't fasten their seat belts, well, it doesn't do us any good, right? So it's very similar here. And so the general principle that we have in SLSA, we say, you're going to trust the platform, but you have to verify the artifacts. So of course, trusting the build platform is the first step in this. And again, there is no absolute there, right? You're going to choose some provider, and whichever it is, and how you make the decision is up to you. There's a whole bunch of different considerations that you should take into account. Obviously, vendors will say, hey, come and use our platform because we're build level 3 of SLSA, and it gives you some level of guarantees. How it is verified, that's still debatable. We don't have a certification program. Some people have been talking about it, but we've just not been able to focus on this yet. So it's not yet there. And so for now, it's like, vendors will claim, and then if they fail short of the expectation, well, they'll get eggs on their face. That's basically the model we are in right now. But so you start with the choice of the build platform, and then once you've decided, okay, I'm going to trust this, then the next step is to verify the artifact that are actually indeed produced by this platform, right? And so this is where back to the model I was describing earlier. I'm not going to get more into the detail, but it's very important not to forget this, because there is a tendency to think, oh, we need to secure the build. Yeah, but we also need to make sure that the people who consume that verify that it's actually the right thing. So this is another point of view of this process, again, based on this the pipeline that I showed earlier. So there's this notion of the build, and you can see there the area that corresponds to the build step. So choosing the right build platform, making sure that what's being inputted into the build is the right stuff. And that touches on the source, obviously, which we'll talk a little bit more because this what's coming next. And then you have to do that recursively because you have dependencies. And again, there's no limit there. It's like where do you stop is up to you. There is no absolute. So I'm happy to say that since SLSA 1.0 came out, there is a whole bunch of tools that have been developed that actually support SLSA Build, the Build Track. And most of them are on level 3, as far as I know. So you have a list here. I'm not going to go through it, but there's a pretty broad choice out there. We also have companies like ActiveState that actually provides SBOM and SLSA attestation for a whole bunch of open source projects. And we have a lot of package registries in different languages. You have NPM is listed there for Node.js that actually support attestations as well, right? And we have more and more of this happening. So this is for what's in 1.0. Now I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what we've been working on all this time. And so we basically have been trying to, as I said earlier, 1.0 kind of fell short in scope compared to 0.1 because we dropped some of the considerations. But so we've been busy trying to address those. The one is source track. So this has to do with, okay, we have all this other part that I showed earlier in my slide, right? About how is the source being managed? How much can you trust the source that you're getting into your build? So that's what the source track is about. And I'll give you a little bit more insight as to that one because it's almost ready to go out. We have a draft as well that has been worked on extensively and is well advanced. And then we have the build environment track. So this touches on the very point I was on earlier where I said, well, where do you stop? So I talked about the build track and what it does. The build platform you trust. Well, what if you don't trust it? So the build environment actually tries to go one level down into the build platform and say, well, you could actually leverage, and to full disclosure, it was actually proposed initially by Intel, and they have an interest in promoting hardware secure hardware environments. And so the idea is, well, the build platform could also produce certificates as how the build platform itself is made, what is made of, and how it runs, etc. So you could actually have the build environment leveraging hardware that provides a higher level of security. So how do you actually expose that information and generate it in a way that can be further consumed? And of course, where do you stop? Again, there's no real stop, right? It's like you go as far as you want, as far as you're comfortable. Another aspect is the dependency track. So there we touch more on the aspect of, that's related to SBOMs, where it's like, well, this is the whole chain of dependencies that you have, what is made of in, how do you make the sausage and what came into the sausage, so to speak. And so it was interesting because in parallel to while we were working in SLSA, Microsoft actually came to OpenSSF with a different specification that had a lot of similarities with SLSA. It had even different levels, but they had started from a completely different viewpoint, which was the consumer part. They say, well, we're not producing. We want to help people who are consuming. And we are trying to define guidelines on how you safely consume open source in general. And so it was very confusing for a while. I have to admit, we spent a lot of time trying explaining why they were two different things. But along the lines, we had a lot of talks, and eventually they came around and said, you know what, you guys that want to develop dependency track, and we think that what we have actually would fit well, and they've been busy basically rewriting their spec into a track that will fit into the SLSA framework. So this is in the works, and you have the link here for the draft. I wanted to give you a little bit more insight as to what's in the source track, because as I said, it's the most developed one, and I think it's interesting to have a little bit of insight as to what's in it. So again, we follow the same idea of different levels. So the first one is version control. I mean, it seems pretty basic, but it's like, well, you need to manage the different versions. And so, it refers to version control system, talking about different, the vocabulary again. This basically refers to things like Git, right? Let's be clear. Then the level 2, you talk about branch histories, like how do you protect branches? How do you make sure that you document, which branch can be consumable, relied upon, and what guarantees are associated with those branches? And it's branches as well as tags, obviously, and so on. Then there is level 3, is the authenticable and auditable provenance. This is the source control system. So now what we're talking about is a bit different from the version control system. The equivalent is like GitLab or GitHub, right? And the idea is that they will produce, certificates about how the source has been changed over time. So they are in a unique position to produce artifacts that can be dependent to know who actually modified the code, how, and was it tampered with, and so on. And they can do it at the very time when they store that information so that there is no chance of having it modified later on. And then it's interesting because it only comes in level 4, is one thing that was actually in the version 0.1 of SLSA, which says that you need to have peer review and enforce that there are at least 2 trusted persons that have reviewed all the changes. Why is it in level 4? And we struggled with it. I'm very glad we came up with this in the end. I can't take credit for it. Some of the people in the group came up with this, but because this is a fairly common way. Most open source projects that are under some kind of big governance structure like LF function that way, as far as I know. But there are, many projects out there where there's a single developer. And for them, it's impossible. It's just like, well, they'll never be able to comply with this. So in fact, this was presented as the first thing you should do. And we came up with the idea that, no, this is the last thing you should do if you can. And it's understood that there are people who won't. They'll never be at level 4 of the SLSA source track, and that's fine. That's just the way it is. But if you're in a bigger organization with a project that can afford this kind of control, then you should do it. And then it will put you at a higher level of security because that's just more secure. We all know that. The fact that some people can't afford doing it should not stop us from acknowledging that it would still be better if you could. So that's the trade-off we came up with. And I thought it was interesting that we ended up on that point. So I'm not going to, I tried really hard to keep up with so that we have time to discuss. This is just a few links so that you can follow up. Obviously, the main site will give you access to everything else. It's salsa.dev, and you'll find there the different specifications, the different versions we have, and the draft that's in the works. We also have the repo and a bunch of other ways to communicate with us. Officially, we are part of the supply chain integrity working group where there are different activities that go on along with the SLSA spec. So I hope this helps you have a better understanding of what SLSA is and what it's not. Obviously, there's a lot more into getting into all the details, some of which I probably can't really talk to, but if there are questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
So thank you very much, Arnaud, for this presentation. I think that was very useful, and I'm very happy that you ended up on this point about peer review, because I remember that this was one of the core issues and core fighting points of particularly people in my community, like the JavaScript community, because most of them are solo developers, and they were like, "There's no way we can do this." So it's interesting how you ended up well, first taking it out and then sort of bringing it back in a way that sort of acknowledged that concern. So there's plenty of folks in the chat with different questions. Let me go through them kind of in order. I think, yeah, the first one is Alistair Woodman was asking sort of how SLSA relates to ISO 27001 and whether SLSA can be used as a way to claim compliance to parts of that standard.
Oh boy, I don't know.
I mean, I'm on the same page, so that's entirely fine. The answer is absolutely okay. I don't know is my go-to answer for pretty much everything at this point. So feel free to just use that card.
I'm looking at you guys are no short. No, sorry, you're not short of questions that I don't know how to answer. But let me get through this. Oh, come on, Eva. Eva has got to know more than me. I like Eva's question. Are you trying to trick me, Eva? By the way,
No.
this presentation is over.
Genuinely, I have not tracked salsa for the past 6 months. So uh,
So
you're talking about
and
changes since I last paid attention. I was wondering if there was anything new.
I don't think anybody has done a recent check and do a kind of a mapping to see exactly what it covers and what it doesn't. And this would be a useful exercise, obviously.
Okay.
And especially, I think once we have the source track in, I think we'll have more coverage and it'll be interesting to do it. But at this point, I really don't know, unfortunately. So,
Got it.
hey, if you guys want to contribute to Salsa with such a mapping, that'd be great.
Right, but it's my question may be that there's an answer the other way around, right? As my assumption is that there are many of the people who are involved in salsa will want to be supporting ISO 27001. So I'm assuming that they will be doing this in the intent that they will be reporting in their ISO 27001 that they're actually using salsa and ergo we're compliant. Otherwise, they're engaged in futile extra work, which I would assume is not their intent.
No,
But
I'm with you. I agree. This is totally a relevant question that we need to have an answer to. That's definitive that we'll agree on, because otherwise, everybody's going to have to figure it out for themselves, which is not very productive.
can you say whether IBM will be using this internally?
We are already. So, Salsa is, so we actually have so it was interesting because we actually have this product, the IBM Cloud One Pipeline, which is a CI/CD platform, which was developed for our own needs. So all the different IBM products now go through that pipeline, and it was instrumented to generate SBOMs and Salsa provenance. And once we developed it to work for us, we said, well, might as well make it available to our customers. So if you go to the IBM Cloud, you find this one pipeline product that you can use to build your own products and or artifacts using the very same tool and generate all that information as well. It's actually, when it comes to Salsa, it's based on Tecton.
Right. And it's reasonable to assume that the IBM compliance team has been watching you doing this and not complained or wagged their finger at you.
So that's a good question. I don't know. I would hope so, but honestly, I'm not involved directly with this group, and so I cannot give a definite answer to that. But obviously, we have people, looking at compliance very closely. So I'm sure eventually they'll get around to that. Indeed.
Eva, you had a follow-up around the attestation documents, or was it kind of addressed?
I think that was what Arnaud was answering. My follow-up was just to notice that on one of the slides there was a phrase, who the contributors were, and every time that has come up in the history of the OpenSSF, I always give it a little eyes emoji.
Yes. So yeah, I know. So Eva touches a very important point, indeed. It's the problem of identifying the contributors, right? And it's well known that, on the one hand, you'd like to know who you're dealing with, and it can help, giving you some insurance that they are not bad actors. At the same time, there are plenty of valid reasons why some people don't want you to know who they really are in real life. And so this is something that, thanks to Eva, we actually did quite a bit of work on trying to find the right wording. And also, there are actually different, it's a bit different if you're in open source and this is actually used in an open source context, or if you use it in an organization like IBM, where, if it's our own developers, well, sorry, if you work for us, we know who you are, and that's just the way it is. And so there's a different, expectation as to, whether you know who they are or not. So, I mean, I know that Eva is very sensitive to this issue for good reason, but I think the actual wording in the spec I hope, is correct and doesn't assume or doesn't require to actually know the real identity of the persons behind those contributions.
Thanks for answering that question. I see then going down on that list, some specific questions about the two trusted reviewer rule, and whether that's one reviewer and the author themselves, or if both the author and the reviewer are trusted, or if it's the author and then two trusted reviewers on top of it.
Yeah, I actually don't know whether I'm not sure what the spec says. I would have to look. You can look it up on SLSA.
Yeah, they're probably where that's more people than they have. So that's all I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean that's clearly a problem for a number of projects.
Yeah. I think yeah, and there is no real standard there, right? Different projects set on different policies, and so I would think that it's at least one non-author, right? Otherwise, there's no point. I mean,
So,
but whether there are two non-authors, I don't know.
Does SLSA have a way to indicate that somebody else reviewed the code who's not part of the project? For example, let's pick any of our favorite. One maintainer has maintained it for 25 years, everyone trusts it, and it's a core part of Red Hat and Canonical's products and so on. Everyone knows who they are. Every new release, it gets reviewed by the vendors pulling it in. Is there a way for those vendors to say, even though they're not part of the project, there's not a Git history of it, in the SLSA framework, yes, we attest as of version whatever, build whatever, we verified the source code's good.
So there is, and I'm not completely up to date on the letters draft. This is an area that has changed a lot lately. They have been trying to nail down all the details. But so I talked quite extensively about the provenance attestations and the verification summaries. And so there's a similar concept being applied to the source. And so I want to think that you could use this for that to address this use case, but I don't know. But we have a source provenance and summary attestation also. And so I think that might actually be your ticket there, but I would have to verify.
And following up, same question from Vicky again about the GitLab plugin. Is there a plugin for GitLab and one that would be open source? Because I think the main GitLab isn't open source.
GitLab. And I don't know the answer. I haven't used it myself. I don't really use GitLab. And what I can tell you is I'm a bit frustrated that GitLab is not more involved in the SLSA specification group. I have personally reached out to them several times, and I have met people from GitLab at conferences trying to hook them in and say, come on, you guys need to participate in this. GitHub is extremely involved, and they're making, I have to give them credit. They're trying really hard not to put anything that would be GitHub specific in the source track. But let's be clear, the source track, right? I said there's like the producers and there's the providers and the version control system. They actually, this is GitHub, right? And GitLab. They are the ones who are going to implement this stuff. So there aren't that many people going to implement it. And like the build, I think there's a lot more build platform out there than there are, source control systems out there. And so I wish, I have a background with W3C where we make sure that there's two implementations of every feature in the spec. And here we don't really always have that. There are other tools that are being developed that try to fill in that gap. And there is a tool from there's a tool called GitHub, for instance, that adds a bunch of things to Git directly. And there's actually a prototype that is in the SLSA framework space. You can find it, that implements the source track requirements on top of GitHub, independently of GitHub. And so there are attempts, but GitLab has been absent, and I think that's very unfortunate. I've told them, look, we're developing the source track. It's very relevant to what you guys are doing. You should be at the table participating and making sure there's nothing we do that wouldn't work for you. But sadly, they still haven't shown up. That's all I can say. I'm kind of frustrated by that. And I'm a third party. I'm not involved. It doesn't concern me. It's more like as a spec, developer, I like to have the relevant parties around the table, so we make sure we're not, blindsided by one particular vendor's view on things.
I hate to end on such a less positive point, but we are reaching the top of the hour. So before I let you go and we close this, I want to thank you again for showing up, obviously, and for shining a light on this really important piece of technology. And maybe you have like a few last words you want to share, or like where can people continue this conversation? I think would be super useful.
So the next version is going to be SLSA 1.2. There should be the source track will be in it. I don't know that we will have the build environment ready for it. We are not going to delay it for this at least. And they're still working on it. They are not as advanced. And speaking of, being one vendor driven, the build environment has been pushed mostly by Intel, and we need to have more people looking into it. And sometimes they talk about stuff that everybody's like, rolling their eyes saying, whoa, what are they talking about? We're not the old expert in this, secure hardware. But so look out for the 1.2. There was a hope that we would have a first candidate release. This is kind of like when we feel like we have addressed all the issues we know and the spec is stable. And so we were hoping to have it ready by the end of this month. I'm not sure it will be, but hopefully it'll be coming soon. So
all right,
for this.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us.
Sorry I couldn't answer
today.
all the questions, but I disclosed up front that I was obviously the most expert.
You did very well, and you answered most of them. And we're very glad to have had you. And we'll be able to share on the mailing list your slides and the recording of the video. Maybe have a follow-up conversation there if you happen to be on the mailing list. Thank you again for joining us, Arnaud, and talk to you soon. Everyone, thank you for joining CRA Mondays, and we'll see you in 2 weeks to look into the legal aspects of CRA compliance. I'm very much looking forward to that session. So see you then. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Ciao.